This is a story about a struggling writer. She gets invited to a writing retreat. She thinks it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with a famous horror novelist. All the invited writers gather at this remote estate, where the house itself has a storied and dark past. We're talking about the New York Times bestseller, The Writing Retreat, with author Julia Bartz, on this Desideratum. A desideratum is an essential thing. I'm audiobook narrator Teresa Bakken, and I think storytelling is essential, both the art of telling and the journey of listening. I want to give a quick thank you to this episode's sponsor, Positron. Positron provides fantastic services for audio artists and producers like me. I use them for prepping and proofing audiobooks. They honestly make my job easier. You can sign up for a free demo of all that they offer at positron.com.
The first seed of this book, it's funny because I had to kind of go back into my files and figure out when I had started it because I didn't remember, because it had been like many years and like many drafts. And the very first draft was actually a NaNoWriMo book from late 2014. So just about 10 years ago now, which is crazy. And it's the very initial seed was the friendship breakup between Alex and Ren. So that was always like the core of the story. And that draft was very different from how it kind of ended up. And for anyone who doesn't know, you probably know what NaNoWriMo is, but NaNoWriMo is National Novel Writing Month, where people get together online every year in November to write a certain amount of words. I should really know the number by now, but I always forget. I think it's around 60,000. And I signed up to do it with my sister, Andy Bartz, and our good friend, Leah Conan. And I think I was the only one that got through those words. But it was so interesting going back. Like I literally went to my Google Docs and was like looking for different key terms, and this popped up. And I was like, oh yeah.
I think that's so interesting. That's so crazy to me that only because this also is sort of a competition or a challenge. Like at the heart of this, one of the hearts of this story is a challenge to writers, a group of writers, to perform a certain number of words per day. So it's kind of funny that the genesis of the story came from you doing that to yourself as a writer, signing up to be challenged, to perform a certain number of days, to force creativity or schedule creativity that way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. It's so strange how things are just in our unconscious and then they pop up in different ways as we're writing. But yeah, I hadn't consciously remembered that, but it did show up in a later version of the writing retreat when, they're at Rosa's retreat and they're tasked with writing an entire novel in 1 month.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the first version. I had set that aside. And then somewhere around this time, I was figuring out whether or not to keep writing books, because I had written a couple of books that were not published and I had to kind of put them in the drawer. So this book was always like in the back of my mind. And then I did get the idea of setting it at a writing retreat. And Rosa is actually this famous horror writer who's in charge. And that felt like the right way to go. But at the time, I was switching careers to becoming a therapist. So there was just like so much happening in my life. And I was like, I don't know if I can write another book and not have anything happen with it. But I did ultimately decide to just move ahead with it. And I was really excited by the idea. And I also decided to use it, again, the later versions, to really like use it as this exercise in exploring my ideas of being a frustrated writer, which kind of comes through in Alex, hopefully.
Yes.
And so it was quite cathartic, actually, to write it.
Yeah, I think that's funny because that's that idea of a plan B of, first finding a way to challenge yourself and schedule the creativity and force yourself to like the exercise of writing is so interesting to me. And then that sometimes when we shift our focus a little and work on something else or develop some other part of ourselves, creativity sneaks back in, that it almost frees that to rise up and find a different voice or a different way to express itself. Like that's so cool that that's a point of your life where this really came to you as a more complete story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think just to jump on to that point, I think that in my quest to switch careers and become a therapist, I never thought about how that would affect my writing and how that would really deepen and enrich it, because I'm really going into this world of psychology, emotions, like even trauma. That's kind of a big theme in the book as well. So it was kind of a nice surprise to realize that those two careers go hand in hand.
Yes. Yes, I sometimes think the more writers that I meet, the more they're always writers. And everything else that feeds them is still the sort of, you're still a storyteller, and everything sort of feeds into that in the other avenues and the ways that you express life and experience life, like that you're ultimately still a storyteller, that you can't really stop that,
Exactly. Yeah. And there's even forms of therapy. There's a type of therapy called narrative therapy, where you help people look at their lives and kind of make it into a narrative or a story so that it makes more sense to them, or so that it feels more empowering. So yeah, that's just really kind of built in.
Well, so for me, one of the essential themes in this is this idea of friendship, and bonds of friendship and complexity of friendship and broken friendship. So the story opens, and one of our main characters is taking a subway ride, and she's on her way to sort of celebrate another friend who's a writer. There's many writers in this story. And she's sort of dreading seeing someone that she's no longer speaking to. But that's a really essential theme to me, this friendship that's broken, and you hook us in. There's even like a sense of dread. This is a thriller. And there's even on the subway, you've threaded through this sort of, there's a sense of dread about their relationship and what's happened.
Friday night commuters filled the sweaty subway car. I stood over two seated girls who were maybe in high school, their mascara-laden eyes darting, hands pulling nervously at hair. One leaned in and said something into the other's ear. She nodded sagely, and they regarded each other with smirks. The interaction jabbed like a penknife in the ribs. Their shared world, their undeniable certainty that they were a team. It reminded me of early days with Wren, holding hands as we rode out to Bushwick, wearing cheap leather leggings, swigging from a shared plastic bottle of vodka and soda. Stop. I curled my fist in my pocket, digging my fingernails into my palm. I couldn't show up like this, with soft, pathetic yearning in my eyes. Wren and I were no longer best friends, or friends at all. And that was fine. I was 30 years old. It didn't make sense that I was still so broken up about a goddamn friendship.
Yeah, I think there was something about the intensity of certain friendships, particularly female friendships, that I wanted to really explore. And I mean, a lot of people have reached out and told me that they have been through this. I think most of us have been through this at some point.
Yeah.
Having these really close friendships that, in our society, romantic relationships are often given kind of top billing, and we're allowed to be, really upset and distraught after those end. But we it's a little bit more confusing in terms of more platonic relationships. Although I will say with this relationship, there's more to the story, but I don't want to give too much away.
No, we won't.
Yeah,
we won't spoil it. But yes, I understand what you're saying is that we oftentimes, the angst of romance and when it ends and that heartbreak that we feel through that, we don't always elevate friendship breakups to that same level. And you've done that here. You feel this trauma between them from the very beginning of the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think currently there's more people that are talking about that and acknowledging that friendships can be, so important in our lives. And like the Call Your Girlfriend authors, Anne Friedman, Aminatou Sow wrote a book I think it was called Big Friendship. And they were talking about their friendship. And again, it's like, it can be really intense. And these are people that you may know for many years and they don't always continue forever. So there is that question that when either something happens, like with Rin and Alex, there's kind of an event that happens that breaks them apart. But it can also be more subtle and maybe you're just kind of moving in different directions. That's something that actually comes up with my clients a lot is friendship issues, and either my friend is fading from me or I don't know how I feel in this friendship anymore. So that was something that, and it's funny to go back to that first iteration. And that again was such an important seed in the story.
Yeah. Yes, I liked it. The other really important seed in the story is how many different stories you weave into it. So it's set, this group of writers, aspiring writers, are given this great opportunity, this great gift to go on a writing retreat. And they're being hosted by someone who's enormously successful that they all admire and look up to. And they get there and are instantly thrown into coming up with a story. And you, as the author of this story, weave together, you give us glimpses of a lot of different stories here. And that was really fun. I think part two, when we get to part two, we're in this spiritualist story. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided to do that, or how important that was for you to the story?
That took a lot of time and energy. And it was almost like an exercise. Like, what would each character at this writing retreat be interested in writing about?
Yeah.
And also remember that they're all fans of Rosa, who writes kind of these feminist horror tales. So they had to kind of have certain themes in common. And yeah, Rosa, that was also an exercise coming up with her novels and being able to talk about them in the book in a way that doesn't feel like, I didn't want it to feel too confusing. Like, it is a little confusing, right? Because we're talking about Rosa's career and like her, like every book is like different for, again, reasons that I can't share.
Yes, but she has this history of stories. So we get some of the glimpses of her stories.
Yeah.
Each one of the characters that's at the retreat is developing a story. So it just is, I don't know, it was just this great buffet of stories. And I don't know, I really enjoyed it. That was not something I think I don't know that I've read another book where authors were gathered together and you got to sort of sit on the sidelines and watch how they work, watch how that percolates, how they develop those ideas. And no, I didn't find it confusing. I thought it was super intriguing. And my favorite was The Great Commission, this spiritualist story. Can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for that story within this story?
Yeah, so for Alex's story, I wanted her novel to focus on the historical background of Rosa's estate, Blackbriar, because first of all, I love haunted house stories. And so I want like this creepy, mansion with this horrific past where people had been murdered, but it's kind of mysterious. And to tie it to, kind of this historical legacy. So one of the inspirations for that story, which again, I hope it's not too confusing, but Alex is writing a novel, but it's based on like a true story that happened at the estate where they're all staying. one of the inspirations for that was this painter named Hilma af Klint, who was a Swedish painter who was truly the first abstract painter. She predated Kandinsky, but her name is becoming more well known, but up until this point has been pretty buried. And she was a spiritualist as well. So she would meet with other women. They called themselves the Five, and they would channel these spirits and energies and do free writing. And her paintings also oftentimes came from a spirit that she was channeling. And I totally stole the idea of the Great Commission because she actually received this quote unquote Great Commission from one of these spirits, and the other women in the group told her not to do it, that she would go mad. But she decided to go forward with it and created these absolutely beautiful paintings that were on display at the Guggenheim a couple of years ago, which is where I saw them and learned about her.
Yeah. I think that's so, I don't know, I just love that. I love that you figured out a way to incorporate that. And I also think it's funny, it is hard to talk about. Sometimes really great stories are hard to have a conversation about unless you want to just spoil everything, right? Because you've done this great job of like almost nesting dolls of story. And many of them are, we have this hint of ghost story. We have this hint of, is there a spirit trying to communicate with one of your characters or not? And that is, I love that it was based on a real artist, that person's art and her story wormed its way into your subconscious and into your desire to tell a great story.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that actually because I'm working on my first newsletter. I was thinking of how I created the writing retreat, and now that I'm working on this new book, my second to be published book, I have not written a new book in quite some time. So it's almost like a new experience, or it's really interesting to see like, well, how, and I do, I'm deep into it and I'm very, very excited about it, but it's cool to see like, how does like a story come together? And I basically realized that I just like it's kind of like a kitchen sink situation where just anything that I'm interested in, or like news stories, historical figures, books that I've read that I want to pay homage to, like they're all thrown together into one work.
Yes, that's what you're drawing from, right? Things that get you excited. Yeah, when I started reading about Hilma and her artist story and this idea of being, she was gathering together with other women, which is again what you've done in this story. You've gathered together women with all their complexities and relationships, and how we see each other's talent and are envious of each other's talent. Like there's how that sometimes sparks self-doubt about our own talent. I just think there were a lot of complex emotions. I love that you drew inspiration from something real. And I think that's funny how you just explained that, really, that it's really just like the kitchen sink. Like these are all my ideas. And how do they weave together into this great story?
I just want to say just on that, I definitely was not sure if I could pull it off either because there was just so much that I wanted to include. And I also had like writer friends who I love dearly who were like, I don't know, this might be like too much stuff, but I feel like I worked it and reworked it enough that hopefully it does all kind of feel necessary.
Yes. Well, it's done really well. And I think, it's been a bit of an overnight success, which probably like is not a fair thing to say since you've worked at the craft of writing for so long, right? And that idea of overnight success feels like a slight almost to some of that, all of the groundwork that you've laid for so long. That was one of the questions I had as I was reading this very powerful character, Rosa, who has such influence over these other writers. She makes a comment about the conditions that produce the best work. being bad, like that you need really, she puts them under very strict pressure, we can say that without spoiling anything. And do you find that's true for you? Do you need to be in sort of like a dire situation to produce to get epiphanies sometimes?
Great question. And no, I actually, the opposite. I mean, yeah. And I think just hearing your question just made me randomly think of these ways that we think about tortured artists and like, oh, you have to be, I don't know, like an alcoholic or like struggling with something to be like a true writer. And
yeah, we kind of honor that, don't we? We honor that idea of suffering for your art.
Totally. Yeah. But I think, and I do think that everyone suffers on some level because we're all human and we go through difficult things. You know, that's just how life is. But and in writing this book too, like I was really trying to do the opposite, where I was trying to make the writing process as easy and enjoyable as possible for me. So it wasn't always easy because, again, I was switching careers and there was just a lot happening. But I think it's because I was able to throw all these things into it that really interested me and made me excited.
Yeah.
So I was able to keep coming back to the story and just enjoy it and, you know, kind of tell myself that no one would ever read it and just push myself to go as dark and disturbing as possible. And I think that was helpful.
Yeah.
You know, instead of this grueling process, you know, it wasn't super fun every day, but overall, I think it was pretty enjoyable to write it.
Yes. You didn't need what Rosa was recommending for you to be able to produce your good work.
Right.
Let's see. Let me check my notes real quick. Oh, I know what else I was going to ask you, but I saw you do an interview and you talked a little bit about finding your voice. And I think it's important to mention that you are that your mother was a librarian, right? And that you're from a family with other writers. Your sister's also extremely successful as a writer, and that as you came into this success and how you were able to find your voice to talk about it, you also drew from family. You know that we are all sort of a collection of the past, right? And you referenced your grandmother. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, my mom was a volunteer librarian and she had a huge hand in getting my sister Andy and me excited about writing. And she would take us she was a librarian at our school, but she would also take us to the public library and we'd constantly be taking books out. And yeah, there was always this respect for stories, I think, growing up. And one of the stories within our family was the background of my mother's parents, who both survived the Holocaust. And both of them, like, amazingly wrote memoirs about their experiences just for our family. And so I remember reading them. I think I was like 12 or 13. I don't think I've really talked about this before, but yeah, they both wrote kind of like these little self-published books with like pictures in them and just really sharing their experiences going through the war.
Wow.
And then living in communist Hungary afterwards and making an escape, like literally on foot across the border to Yugoslavia. The border was shutting down. It's crazy. Like, it's still hard for me to believe that actually happened. It feels so, so disturbing and dramatic. But it was always just something that we knew. And it wasn't like my grandparents talked about that a lot. Like, they, for the most part, when they came to the US, they really wanted to move forward. But writing their memoirs was their way of going back over their experiences in this kind of cathartic way.
Yes. And making sure that the story survived.
Yeah, exactly. So that, I was so grateful. My grandfather has passed, but my grandma is still alive, and just saw her a few weeks ago. And she's doing great. But yeah, there was always this feeling of this kind of dark history. And that was something that I wanted to include in this book as well, is just how our history societally and then within our families too can really affect us. And I think that's why with this book, I also wanted to bring up the Holocaust, and like Rosa's Hungarian, as is the main character, her mother is Hungarian. So they kind of bond over that.
Yeah.
And have that be in both of their backgrounds and part of their trauma.
Yeah. And I think it's so remarkable to have been given the gift of a powerful story like that. Like, I think the courage to write it down, the courage to create a memoir from a survival story like that, and that you would have grown up with that being part of you as well, right? Like, that's just an incredible gift. And I don't know. And I think also the article that I read had to do too with sort of finding your voice, was what I wrote down about it, where it's not always easy to speak in public. It's not always easy to talk about your work. And I think we just assume that authors want to do that. Honestly, like, we just assume you just can't wait. Just tell us all about it. But it's not. It's easier. I think it's one thing to be able to create on the page and put story down, and it's another one completely to be able to talk to people about it.
Yeah, I mean, that was my greatest fear. I mean, I was so excited when the book got picked up, but I knew that I would have to be doing these public facing events and interviews and podcasts, and that was just completely overwhelming and terrifying to me. And I did find an amazing public speaking coach, and she's also a somatic therapist, Erica Ackerman, in LA, for anyone who might be looking for someone similar. And she really helped me both with the physical, like, nervous system activation and how to handle that, but then also she's a somatic therapist, so she also had some very therapeutic techniques for going into this idea of why it was so scary for me to use my voice and to share myself and expose myself in this way. Because I do feel like this book is very personal in a lot of ways, even though it's a crazy, unhinged thriller. There's also a lot in there that does feel very personal. And so it didn't feel natural for me. Like, I'm definitely not a performer, to be able to just know how to talk about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for talking to me about it.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Yeah.
I appreciate it. And I think the last question I'll ask you, you've been so generous with your time. The last question I'll ask is, the name of the podcast is Desideratum, which is Latin for an essential thing, something you desire as essential. And I like to ask storytellers, for you, and you can answer it as an author or any way you'd like. For you, if you had to explain to somebody what's essential, what do you say?
Oh, wow. I love that. I'm so happy that you explained the word to me, because I was planning to look it up. So I'm glad that you shared that. And I love that. I love that word. I'm definitely going to file that away. The essential thing, I think for me, and I think it's a major theme of this book too, is self-compassion over shame.
Wow.
And that might sound a little heavy, but there were definitely things that I was working through when writing this book, including this feeling of being a failed writer. Like, I tried to write multiple books and get them published. It didn't happen. And I think in our society, until at least you start seeing kind of the underpinnings and the structure and the system and how everything works against most people just in general, right?
Yeah.
there's just this idea that things are going to work out if you work hard enough. And I do think that they eventually do work out for creative people, but it just might take a lot more time than you're thinking. And for me, being a writer was always first and foremost like my identity. That's who I considered myself to be from a very early age. So when things were working out and I was seeing, all these friends getting published around me, it really led to this kind of identity crisis. And, maybe I am not good enough. And it was pretty tough. And funnily enough, that's when I first started my own therapy journey with my therapist in my early 30s. And that led me to wanting to become a therapist as well, because in that space, I was able to work through these feelings of shame and failure and come out the other side feeling much more compassion for myself. And I think overall, it led me to see writing in a very different way, which, as Alex says at the end of the book, and I don't think, or towards the end, I'll say, and I don't think this is a spoiler, but she really realizes that she is a writer, regardless of whether or not she's ever published. So, so I think that is the essential thing, to just know that, we're really thrown around by these external forces around us. And, hopefully we can do activist work around changing that. And at the same time, hopefully in the midst of that, have a lot of compassion for ourselves, and also know that the things that we feel shame for are just very human. They're just a part of all of us normally. And talking about them can be really, really helpful and help that shame kind of dissipate.
Yes. I love that.
Oh, good.
I love the way you articulated that. I think that is just so universally, I almost just feel a weight lifting off to me just listening to you say that, right? Like, just compassion for ourselves is so hard. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. That was really great.
That's good. Yeah, I love that question.
I hope you enjoyed getting to know Julia Bartz, author, therapist, and creative coach, as much as I did. You can follow her and get her newsletter through her website, juliabartz.com. I'll put a link in the show notes. Thanks also to Wendy Gardner and Allison Hinchcliffe at Simon & Schuster for providing the compelling audiobook sample, narrated by the wonderful and award-winning Gail Shallen. I hope you want to hear the rest of the audiobook. I'll put an affiliate link for Libro.fm in the show notes. When you listen to audiobooks through Libro FM, you can pick a local bookstore to benefit from your purchase. And if you follow my link, it also supports the podcast. Finally, if you enjoy the podcast, please interact with it. Like, subscribe, follow, leave a review on any platform where you listen. And really, thanks for listening.